Could you have survived early medieval England? A serf's tale. Could you survive early medieval England living as a serf? Was life back then really easier than we think, or was it a daily struggle just to stay alive? In this video, we're diving into the heart of early medieval life to try and prize out the answer to this question. What about life's daily challenges? Imagine waking up in a freezing one-room home that you share with your pig and chickens, eating coarse bread every day, and battling disease without modern medicine. How did anyone make it out alive? What was it like being a woman in early medieval England? From oppressive traditions to the dangers of childbirth, the challenges women faced might shock you. So please take a trip with me to explore the unexpected truths about early medieval survival in England as a serf. The untold stories of people's resilience and the gritty realities of daily life. By the end, you will know if you could have survived the hazards and pitfalls life in early medieval England would throw at you. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So, you have just been transported to early medieval England. Now I am going to make it easy for you and enable you to be able to freely communicate with your fellow people. Ordinarily, of course, this would be quite impossible. Old English would be the language in use, and understanding someone speaking it would be next to impossible because its grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation are vastly different from modern English. It's essentially a completely different language, despite it being an ancestor of English. But that's as easy as you're going to have it. Now, you may be able to converse with the locals, but what kind of life and social class could you expect to be in? Well, in early medieval England, the lives of the vast majority of the population, around 85%, were defined by their status as serfs. So as this is the vast majority, that is what you will be, a serf, and consequently very poor. This also means that you would be tied to the land that you worked and thus subjected to backbreaking labor, and you would have to endure living conditions that were often harsh and unforgiving. Your existence would be a stark contrast to the lives of the nobility and clergy who held the power and wealth. The defining characteristic of serfdom was the bond to the land. Unlike slaves who were considered property, serfs were tied to the land they worked, meaning they couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission. This lack of freedom severely restricted their movement and opportunities. They were essentially part of the estate, and their lives were intertwined with its fortunes. This arrangement provided stability for the feudal system, ensuring a consistent labor force for the lords who owned the land. Well, as you are a serf, you can be considered part of the backbone of the early medieval agricultural economy. Your daily life would revolve around arduous physical labor, primarily in the fields where you would toil. From dawn till dusk, performing tasks such as plowing, sowing, harvesting, and tending to livestock. These tasks were physically demanding, often performed with rudimentary tools and under harsh weather conditions. The work would be relentless, with little respite throughout the agricultural seasons. This constant physical exertion would take its toll on your body, leading to exhaustion and injuries, and would generally contribute to a lower life expectancy. So sadly, we are not off to the best of stars. What about food? Well, being a serf or peasant, your diet would be pretty basic and monotonous, largely consisting of grains such as barley and wheat, which we use to make bread in a form of porridge. These staples were supplemented with whatever vegetables you could grow in your small garden, such as beans, peas, and onions. Now, meat would be a rare luxury, usually only consumed on special occasions or feast days. Hunting in the early Middle Ages was the preserve of the nobles. It provided meat, furs, and leather, with deer, boar, and small game being common targets. However, all this was governed by strict rules and often restricted to the aristocracy. On royal lands, forests were protected by forest laws, reserving large areas for the elite, while peasants faced harsh penalties for poaching. So there would be no hunting for you unless you wanted to feel the full force of the law. Your limited diet would result in you lacking essential nutrients, leading to deficiencies and health problems. The lack of variety and nutritional value would contribute to your susceptibility to diseases and a lower overall health status. Contaminated water sources also would pose a significant threat to you and all else. Rivers and wells were often polluted with human and animal waste, leading to the spread of waterborne diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. The lack of proper sewage systems and waste disposal methods exacerbated the problem. While the wealthy might have had access to cleaner water sources in some cases, the overall sanitation conditions meant that everyone faced a risk of infection. Dysentery was certainly no respecter of rank. As far as housing goes, you would typically live in a small, simple dwelling made of wattle and daub with a thatched roof. Serfs' houses were usually 1 or 2 rooms shared with their families and sometimes even their animals. So yes, you would be on first-name terms and good friends with your pigs and sheep. However, the lack of proper ventilation and sanitation made these dwellings damp, smoky, and prone to infestations. Overcrowding was common, further exacerbating the unsanitary environment that you would have to live in. These poor living conditions would, of course, contribute to the spread of disease and respiratory problems, further impacting your health and well-being. You now know what kind of life you will have to live and how difficult that would be. So taking all that into consideration, what effect would that have on your overall life expectancy? Well, the average life expectancy in early medieval England was strikingly low by modern standards. Men and women could expect to live to between 30 and 35 years of age. These figures, however, are averages calculated at birth and heavily skewed by extremely high infant and child mortality rates. It's crucial to understand that these numbers don't imply that people routinely died in their 20s or 30s. Those who survived childhood could live much longer into their 40s, 50s, or even beyond. Nevertheless, the constant threat of early death significantly lowered the overall average age. Okay, I have done you another favor and transported you to early medieval England as an early 20-year-old. This means that thankfully you will have avoided the pitfalls that early childhood can throw at you, and you can look forward to a good few years in front of you. Well, hopefully. So it goes without saying that the loss of children was a tragically common occurrence. Roughly 1/3 of all children died before reaching the age of 5. This devastatingly high infant and child mortality rate stemmed from a combination of interconnected factors. Malnutrition played a significant role as inadequate nutrition weakened children's immune systems, making them highly vulnerable to infections. The limited medical knowledge of the time meant that effective treatments for common childhood illnesses were at best scarce, but mostly non-existent. This lack of understanding contributed to the spread and severity of diseases like whooping cough and measles, which were particularly deadly for young children. These diseases, coupled with other infections like dysentery and respiratory illness, often proved fatal in a time before modern medicine and sanitation. Therefore, the loss of so many young lives was a consequence of both environmental and medical limitations. Crop failures due to weather fluctuations, pests, or disease were common, leading to periods of famine and widespread malnutrition. Even in years of relative plenty, the lack of a balanced diet meant that many people suffered from vitamin and mineral deficiencies, further compromising their health. Water sources were often contaminated, and living in close proximity to animals further increased the risk of diseases transmitted from animals to humans. One threat looming over the population may well surprise many people. Poisoning. Yes, this is another hazard you would have to negotiate. Poisoning took various forms and affected different social strata in distinct ways. While food scarcity and infectious diseases pose constant dangers to all, poisoning added another layer of vulnerability, with specific hazards targeting both the wealthy and the general populace. For the wealthy, lead poisoning was a significant concern. Lead was widely used in various household items and construction materials. One common source of exposure was glazed pottery. The glazes used to create these ceramics often contain lead, which could leach into food and drink, especially acidic substances like wine or fruit juices. Over time, this chronic exposure to lead could lead to a range of health problems, including neurological damage and even death. Lead was also present in other items like paints. The cumulative effect of lead exposure from multiple sources posed a serious health risk for mainly affluent individuals. For the wider population, ergot poisoning, also known as ergotism or St. Anthony's fire, presented a far more widespread and dramatic threat. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in damp conditions. When contaminated grain was used to make bread, the ergot alkaloids present in the fungus could cause severe illness. The symptoms of ergot poisoning were varied and terrifying. One form, known as convulsive ergotism, caused painful muscle spasms, seizures, and hallucinations. It also sometimes led to bizarre outbreaks known as dancing epidemics, where uncontrollable muscle spasms and convulsions would manifest as frenzy dance-like movements. Those afflicted would sometimes dance for hours or even days, seemingly unable to stop until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion, injury, or even death. These episodes, often interpreted through a religious lens as demonic possession or divine punishment, highlight the profound impact of ergot poisoning on both the physical and mental state of individuals and communities in this period. There's another form of ergot poisoning that you would have to avoid, and that would be gangrenous ergotism. This restricted blood flow to the extremities, leading to intense burning sensations, followed by gangrene, the death of tissue, which could result in the loss of limbs. Outbreaks of ergotism in its various forms were often widespread and could cause significant mortality and social disruption. The dramatic symptoms, particularly the hallucinations and gangrene, often led people to believe they were afflicted by divine punishment or indeed witchcraft. So, if all that wasn't enough, you would be at an even greater disadvantage if you were to be a woman in early medieval England. Women's lives were strictly limited by a male-dominated society shaped by the biblical teachings of the time. These interpretations often portrayed women as subordinate to men, tracing this hierarchy back to the biblical story of Adam and Eve, where Eve's transgression was seen as the origin of sin and suffering. This religious framework provided a powerful justification for the oppression of women and shaped their roles and expectations within society. Furthermore, as we mentioned before, childbirth posed a significant threat to women's lives. Medical knowledge was limited, and childbirth was often a dangerous and unpredictable event. Complications such as infections, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor were common and frequently resulted in maternal death. The lack of proper sanitation and medical intervention further increased the risks associated with childbirth. Beyond domestic and agricultural duties, women had limited legal rights and were largely excluded from positions of power and influence. Their lives were primarily defined by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, or mothers. What are you looking at? While some women, particularly those from noble or royal families, could exert influence through their family connections, these cases were exceptions rather than the rule. The vast majority of women lived within a system that restricted their autonomy and limited their opportunities for personal and social development simply because they were female. Now, this brings us nicely onto the English judicial system of the time. Let us hope that you would not transgress the laws of the day and be subject to the subsequent punishments. The church wielded significant influence over both spiritual and secular life, shaping social norms and contributing to the legal framework of the time. While not directly administering secular law in all cases, the church's moral authority and its close relationship with the ruling powers meant that religious doctrine permeated the legal system. This influence is evident in the strict laws governing various aspects of life and the brutal punishments meted out for transgressions. The church's teachings emphasize morality, obedience, and adherence to religious doctrine. Sins were not merely spiritual failings, but could also be considered offenses against the social order, thus warranting earthly punishment. This perspective led to the criminalization of behaviors that the church deemed morally reprehensible, including theft, gambling, and other acts considered disruptive to social harmony. The punishments for these crimes were often harsh and carried out in public, serving as a deterrent to others. Flogging was a common punishment for various offenses, including theft, particularly repeated offenses, or those involving significant value. Branding, often with a hot iron, was another form of punishment used to mark criminals, serving as a permanent reminder of their transgression and a form of social ostracism. This mark could be placed on the hand, face, or other visible parts of the body. One of the most distinctive features of the legal system in this period was the trial by ordeal. This practice, often sanctioned by the church, involved subjecting the accused to a painful, dangerous test, the outcome of which was believed to be determined by divine intervention. The logic behind this was that God would protect the innocent and reveal the guilty. Several forms of ordeal were practiced. Ordeal by hot iron. The accused was required to carry a red-hot iron for a certain distance. The hand was then bandaged, and if the wound healed cleanly within a specified time, the accused was deemed innocent. If the wound festered, it was considered proof of guilt. Ordeal by hot water. The accused had to retrieve a stone from a pot of boiling water. The hand was then bandaged and the healing process observed, similar to the ordeal by hot iron. Ordeal by cold water. The accused was thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were considered guilty, as the pure water was believed to reject the impure. If they sank, they were considered innocent and hopefully pulled out before drowning. These ordeals were deeply rooted in religious beliefs and reflected a worldview where divine intervention was seen as a legitimate means of determining guilt or innocence. The church's involvement in these practices further solidified its influence over the legal system. It's important to note that the application of these laws and punishments could vary depending on social status. While the laws theoretically applied to everyone, the wealthy and powerful often enjoyed greater leniency and could sometimes avoid the harshest punishments. However, for the majority of the population, the threat of brutal punishment for even relatively minor offenses served as a powerful means of social control. The combination of strict laws dictated by religious principles and the use of harsh punishments characterized the legal landscape of early medieval England. So, if all this wasn't enough, if you were male, you would have one final hazard to negotiate: warfare. This was a pervasive feature of life in early medieval England, impacting all levels of society, but particularly devastating for the peasant class. These conflicts stemmed from various sources, including internal power struggles between rival kingdoms, succession disputes, and external threats, most notably from Viking incursions. These constant conflicts had profound social, economic, and demographic consequences. One of the most significant impacts of these wars was the forced conscription of peasant farmers, the backbone of the medieval economy. These individuals were often compelled to leave their fields and families to serve in their lord's or king's army. Unlike professional soldiers or trained warriors, peasants were typically ill-equipped and lacked extensive military training. They were often armed with rudimentary weapons like spears, axes, or even farm implements. This lack of training and equipment made them extremely vulnerable in battle, leading to high casualty rates among their ranks. The impact of forced military service on peasant communities was multifaceted. Removing a significant portion of the agricultural workforce disrupted farming cycles, leading to food shortages and economic hardship. The absence of men also left families vulnerable and unprotected, further exacerbating the social and economic strain caused by warfare. Invasions, particularly those from the Danes, were a major source of conflict and fatalities during this period. Beginning in the late 8th century, Danish raids on the English coast intensified, evolving from small-scale plundering expeditions to large-scale invasions aimed at conquest and settlement. These invasions brought widespread destruction and loss of life. Coastal communities were particularly vulnerable to raids, with villages and monasteries often targeted for their wealth. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a primary source for this period, is filled with accounts of Viking raids describing the devastation they wrought. The scale of these invasions increased over time, culminating in the establishment of the Danelaw, a region of England under Danish control. This period saw major battles and prolonged periods of conflict between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Danish invaders. The impact of these wars and invasions extended beyond immediate casualties. The destruction of crops, livestock, and infrastructure led to famine and economic instability. The constant threat of violence and disruption also created a climate of fear and uncertainty, impacting daily life for all members of society. So warfare was a constant presence with significant consequences for the population. Serfs, often forced into military service, suffered disproportionately high casualties due to their lack of training and equipment. The combined effects of these conflicts had a profound impact on the social, economic, and demographic landscape of the period. Well, if you've got this far, you may well be thinking, oh my God, how can anyone have negotiated all the hazards and pitfalls life could have thrown at you in those far-off days? Well, you have to remember they knew nothing else. The people of those days had no experience of social or welfare support, personal advancement opportunities, plus so much more that most people take for granted today. However, like us, there were still human beings. They still had hopes and aspirations, albeit tailored to their situations. They still fell in love, raised families, fostered friendships, laughed and joked, despite the clouds that hung over them. So, there you have it. Living in England as a serf in the early medieval period was no easy task. But could you have negotiated the hazards that you would have faced? Please leave a comment and let me know. Well, thanks very much for watching another episode from History's Life Story. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy these videos. Take care, and I will see you next time.